Yat, my relatives. Good afternoon. This is Mark Charles. It is about 12:50. It's almost 1 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., and I'm sitting down to my second cup of coffee. And I want to discuss two things. I want to discuss today both Andrew Yang and Liz Cheney and some of the things that they've been doing out on their respective political trails. So I welcome you to grab your cup of coffee, sit down and join me. I just want to have a discussion here for the next 15 to 20 minutes. Let me go ahead and finish up sharing something on my Twitter page so I can get people watching on YouTube, and then we'll get started. But as I always do, before I begin, I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from what's now known as Washington, D.C., and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to thank and honor the Piscataway people. I want to acknowledge that they are still here, and I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands, and I want to state publicly how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. Let me share this tweet out over from my YouTube channel so people on Twitter can follow me, and then we'll be able to get started here. Hold on just a second. Okay. There's two articles I want to share with you first. The first one is in AP, and it was regarding Liz Cheney. Now, if you've been following the news, you'll know that today Liz Cheney was ousted from her leadership position within the House of the GOP. And she was ousted because of her very strong support, our condemnation, I should say, of President Trump and the lies that he's continuing to tell about how the election was stolen from him. And so she gave a speech in the House last evening, I believe it was, and it was voted today fairly quickly. It was like a 20-minute closed-door meeting, and she was removed from her position in the House leadership. The second article I want to share with you is regarding mayoral candidate and former presidential candidate Andrew Yang. And Andrew Yang, he got himself into a little bit of trouble yesterday regarding a tweet that he gave, with a kind of a one-sided, really full-throated support of Israel and condemning the bombing by Hamas. And there was an article in Politico today. It was titled "Andrew Yang Reaps Liberal Backlash and Conservative Support from His Israel Tweet." And I want to talk about both of these things and talk about how they're actually very similar issues. And though we have people from opposing parties, the way they're seeking to quell the fears of even their own supporters, because they both gain support from the opposing party, but the way they're trying to quell the fears of their own party is by appealing to the myth of American exceptionalism. So we'll start with this this quote, or this speech by Liz Cheney. And I actually sat down this morning and I was going to tweet about it, because all of the headlines I heard and everything that was coming out on the news this morning was talking about her speech last night, and how one quote that she said was, "Remaining silent and ignoring lies emboldens the liar. And I will not participate in that." And this was about a 6-minute speech she gave condemning Donald Trump. And the lies that he's continuing to tell about how the election was stolen, and how she is a true conservative, and she is calling the GOP to come back to its conservative values, which are not being shared by Donald Trump. And so I actually sat down and I was going to tweet this. I was going to tweet, "I am bewildered by House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Senate Minority Leader, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, and almost all the rest of the GOP, not only for continuing to blindly endorse Trump's long invalidated claims of voter fraud, but for punishing members of their own party who speak sensibly against him. I applaud Liz Cheney for speaking truth to the GOP. Now, I had that all spaced out. It was out exactly the number of characters I needed, and I was about ready to tweet it. And I thought, well, I should probably listen to her speech. And so I found her speech. I found it online. I'll actually share it both. I'll share it on Twitter right now, and then I'll give the link in the notes later for Facebook as well. But this is a link to a tweet by Liz Cheney, which connects to her speech she gave last night, about 6 minutes long. And I thought I should listen to it before I kind of publicly applaud Liz Cheney, just because I don't trust either party, both the Democrats or the Republicans, to not say something that would absolutely, I would have to disagree with. And so listening to her speech, right, she started out talking about the constitutional duty to protect freedom. And she gave 3 examples, one from Kenya, one from Russia, and one from Warsaw, of 3 people struggling to fight against oppression or to hold on to democracy, whether it's voting or communism. They're fighting against communism. And she gave 3 examples of 3 different people who she met who were struggling to protect freedom. And then about the 1 minute, 45 second point, she goes into, she actually says that she was spoken to by people about the miracle of America that was captured in the words of Ronald Reagan, and that's what inspired them. And then she went into about a 2-minute section talking about faith and freedom. So now it's getting troubling because we're talking about the miracle of America, right? So this land is a miracle, something initiated by God. And then faith and freedom, and how our faith is deeply tied to our freedom. And she quoted John Paul. She actually talked about how Pope John Paul, even after speaking against oppression other places around the world, met her father, Dick Cheney, and looked him in the eye, she said, and told him, God bless America. And then Liz Cheney stated that God has blessed America. Now, if you've heard me speak before, you know, right, this is problematic. The United States of America is not rich and powerful because of God's blessing. We are not God's chosen people. We are not somehow favored by God above other nations. We do not have promised lands. We are not powerful and prosperous and rich because of God's blessing. We are powerful and prosperous and rich because that's what happens when your church arms you with the doctrine of discovery and you claim to discover lands that are already inhabited, and then you ethnically cleanse them through acts of genocide, and then you kidnap and enslave African people and bring them here and have them build up your nation. When you do that and you are not held accountable, you become unbelievably wealthy, over the top, unbelievably prosperous. It's not about God's blessing. It's about your exploitation and your oppression and your dehumanizing worldviews. That's why you're prosperous. That's why you're rich. This is why America is the most powerful nation in the world. This is why America has the most wealthy banks in the world. It's not because we're blessed by God. It's because we have never been held accountable for our injustices. And so I disagree with you, Liz Cheney. God has not blessed America. We are not rich and prosperous because of God's blessing. We are rich and prosperous because we are unjust, we exploit, we oppress, and we've never been held accountable. And then she went on to talk about how even they, as Congress members of Congress, they have to honor the oath that they took before God in that very chamber, she said, to support and defend the Constitution. Now, again, the Constitution, right? We the people, Article 1, Section 2, never mentions women, specifically excludes natives, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. Our Constitution, we've never abolished slavery. Actually, slavery is protected within the 13th Amendment. It's redefined and codified under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. Our Constitution is a white supremacist document that states that the white landowning male has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. And she's saying, yes, we've taken an oath before God to support and defend this white supremacist, racist, and sexist document. Around the 2:45 or 3-minute mark, she finally gets into her denouncement of Trump. She says her famous quote, lies, or she talks about the lies that election were stolen, are actually undermining our democracy. She gives examples of how not only has the Electoral College voted in favor of Joe Biden winning, but conservative judges and even Trump's own Justice Department did not find voter fraud existed and supported the victory of Joe Biden. She talks about how she is a conservative and the true conservatives have reverence for the rule of law. And the law states now through the Electoral College and through the judicial system that Joe Biden's president. And she says, this election is over. Remaining silent and ignoring the lie, she said, emboldens the liar, and I will not participate in that. Now, these are the words that I applaud. I applaud you, Liz Cheney, for speaking truth to Trump and for trying to knock some sense into the rest of your political party. These few minutes that you spoke here, 2 minutes, minute and a half in the middle of your speech, I agree with you. And we do need to hold Trump accountable for his lies. We do need to denounce the lies he's continuing to perpetuate, and we need to get past that. I absolutely agree, and I applaud you for saying that. Now, I want to go into Andrew Yang, and well, so Liz's speech won her a fair amount of support from both Democrats and Republicans, notably from some Democrats. And there was a article in Reuters that was titled, "She's a Hero, Liz Cheney Down But Not Out in Wyoming After Crossing Trump." And this article in Reuters gives examples of how Liz Cheney has actually won the support of some Democrats who appreciate her willingness to speak up against Donald Trump in the Republican Party. Now I want to talk about Andrew Yang. So the other day, I think it was on Monday, Andrew Yang tweeted after there were reports that Hamas had sent some bombs into Israel. Andrew Yang tweeted, "I am standing with the people of Israel who are coming under bombardment attacks and condemn the Hamas terrorists. The people of New York City will always stand with our brothers and sisters in Israel who face down terrorism and persevere." And I'll share that tweet that he sent out. Now, that tweet generated a lot of interaction by Andrew Yang, especially from more liberal people in New York City, who immediately called out this one-sided statement of support and did not mention at all the unethical and even oppressive behavior that Israel was demonstrating toward the Palestinians because they were protesting. The reason this violence started was because the protest of the Palestinian people, because they were about ready to be evicted from some of their homes in East Jerusalem. And Andrew Yang's tweet made no mention of that. And so he was called out immediately for that. And there was actually, but he was also supported. He won the endorsement or the support of Ted Cruz, of Stephen Miller, and of Donald Trump Jr. I'll actually share an article with you that was published by Business Insider titled "Republicans like Ted Cruz and Stephen Miller cheering on Andrew Yang after he posted a pro-Israel tweet amid violent clashes with Palestinians." And right, so if you ever would have told Andrew Yang, especially during his presidential run a year and a half ago, that he would be endorsed or supported by Stephen Miller, Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump Jr., he would have laughed at you. But very much so, they actually tweeted, and you can see in that article, there are tweets where they actually retweeted his initial tweet and they supported his words. And there was a lot of support by the Republican Party for Andrew Yang's support of Israel. Now, it was on Monday where I did a second cup of coffee discussing how because both Israel and the United States claim a legacy of promised lands, that leads to ongoing oppression. It justifies the oppression in their minds of, here in the US, of enslaved people and of native peoples. And it justifies the ongoing oppression in Israel of the Palestinians and the Bedouins. So because both nations claim a legacy of promised lands, they actually use that legacy to justify ongoing racial and ethnic violence against people, even within their own borders. And we don't call this out. I talk frequently about the dysfunctional relationship that exists between the United States of America and the modern nation state of Israel. We need their legacy of Old Testament legacy of promised lands to justify our behavior against Africans and Native Americans. And they need our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify their ongoing oppression against Bedouins and Palestinians. The reason there is bipartisan support, almost blanket bipartisan support for Israel in the United States, has nothing to do with freedom or equality. It's because we need their flourishing and they need our flourishing to justify our ongoing oppressive behavior. Our relationship with the modern nation state of Israel is very dysfunctional and codependent. And it's all tied up in this legacy of promised lands. And that's what the Palestinians are protesting in Israel. They are about ready to be evicted from their homes, some of them from their homes in East Jerusalem, for settlers to come in, Israeli settlers to come in and take those lands from them. And they are protesting that, and that protest resulted in violence. And that violence on both sides needs to stop. But Israel needs to end their ethnic violence, their racial violence against Palestinians. And they need to stop their removal of these people from their lands. What has initiated this violence is absolutely unjust, and it needs to end. And Andrew Yang's tweet mentioned nothing of that. Now, both candidates are both politicians in their words. Again, they faced backlash from some of their own party, but they had bipartisan support from others in the opposing party. But they had to unify the two, right? They had to find a way to bring the two together. And so Andrew Yang actually followed up his tweet with a statement that he put out on Twitter. And he also put this on his Facebook page. I'm giving a link to it right now. And I want to just read it. It's not very long. I want to read it. It's on both his Facebook page and his Twitter page. And it says here, I spoke to a group of volunteers for the campaign yesterday, some of whom have been with me for years. Many of them were upset with my recent tweets expressing solidarity with the people of Israel in conjunction with the violence in the region this week that has claimed the lives of innocents and children on both sides. They expressed to me that they follow and support me for a number of reasons. One is that I am a clear-headed person who follows facts. The other is that I am a human being who stands for universal values of fellowship and goodwill. They felt that my tweet was overly simplistic in my treatment of a conflict that has a long and complex history full of tragedies, and they felt it failed to acknowledge the pain and suffering on both sides. They were, of course, correct. I mourn for every Palestinian life taken before its time, and as I do for every Israeli. Suffering and pain and violence and death suffered by anyone hurts us all, and people who want to be able to live in peace. We all want that for ourselves and our children. Support for people does not mean blind to the pain and suffering of others. Again, everyone simply wants to be able to live and pray in peace. And that is what we want as well. I join with millions around the world praying that the current situation be resolved as quickly as possible, peacefully and with minimal suffering. For those who have spoken to me on this, thank you. Continue to believe in humanity. So that was his response. He feels bad about the Palestinians who died, and he acknowledged that that is unfortunate. However, He did not call out Israel for evicting these Palestinian families and allowing settlers to move into these lands. He does not call out the laws in Israel that state settlers can claim these lands, but Palestinians can't. He did not call out the ongoing oppression. And that's the problem, right? This is why America supports Israel, because they are doing the same thing that we did here. And so while his comments will get him the support of a majority of Americans, it does not actually address the oppression, the injustice that Israel is doing to the Palestinians and to the Bedouins. And that's the injustice that needs to be called out. But our politicians don't have the courage to do that. Liz Cheney, in her attempt to get back into the good side of her party, she ended her speech by talking about the military. And she quoted, I think it was the father of someone who died in a war, who reminded her that standing up for the truth honors all who gave all. And Liz Cheney went on to talk about how, because so many Americans have laid down their lives for this country, their love of country, she said, is more. Like we have to get above politics. We have to get above this bickering, and we have to have our love for country above all else. And she talks about how we have to protect our Constitution and freedom that has been paid for by the blood of so many. Now, I do not deny that there are many, many, many people who fought in wars protecting this country, who fought in wars fighting oppression, whether it's Nazi Germany or whether it's other nations where there's actual oppression going on and our soldiers go in there and fight. But when we make these blanket statements that every life lost for the strengthening and protection of America and our Constitution and our freedom is just and right and needs to be honored and revered, completely ignores our history, right? We have 425 medals of honor given to U.S. soldiers for the Indian War campaigns. We have 20 medals of honor specifically for soldiers who died in the massacre at Wounded Knee. We hold up one of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, who ethnically cleansed and committed genocidal acts against natives to make way for the Transcontinental Railway in Minnesota and Colorado and in the Territory of New Mexico. Now, the way the country explains that away is exactly what we saw Nancy Pelosi do the other day. After the conviction in the case of, for Derek Chauvin, in the case of the murder of, why can't I think of his name right now? George Floyd. Where she thanked George Floyd for sacrificing his life for justice. Right? She wanted to add him to that list of people who have laid down their lives to strengthen this country. That didn't happen. He didn't lay down his life as a sacrifice. This nation murdered him. This nation sacrificed him to its god of white supremacy and racism. Right? My Navajo people who were ethnically cleansed by Abraham Lincoln, we didn't lay down our lives for the strengthening of this country. We were ethnically cleansed. We were genocidally removed from our lands so this nation could complete its manifest destiny. And there were U.S. soldiers who went in, yes, some who died, who went in to ethnically cleanse us from these lands. when we make this blanket statement of every life lost in the strengthening of this nation and the protection of our white supremacist constitution is somehow holy. We're creating a mythological history, and we're celebrating not only injustice, but actual genocide. We cannot make these kind of statements. We have to acknowledge this is what's so problematic about not having a common memory. But that's how she ended her speech, by talking about the sacrifice of people who've laid down their lives to protect our Constitution and our freedom. All right, that's the trump card, no pun intended. That's what will unite almost all Americans. In fact, it was so effective, and this was even before, but they knew what she was going to do. Brookings actually published an article, and they said Liz Cheney won't be speaker, but she could be president. Right? Because that's how a president speaks. The president knows how to whip up this myth of American exceptionalism and bring both sides together under this mythological banner of freedom and equality, which doesn't exist and was actually never truly advocated for within our nation. But that's the makings of, that could make her the first Republican president, woman Republican president, they said. So these are the problems that we're facing, my relatives. These are the challenges that we have. We don't have a common memory. We haven't removed the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy from our foundations. We don't know how to talk accurately and honestly about our history. And because of that, we advocate for things that make no sense. And we try to build a unity around things that are actually very divisive and even oppressive and dehumanizing. And so today, Andrew Yang, Liz Cheney, Donald Trump Jr., Stephen Miller, and Ted Cruz were all unified. They were united under the myth of American exceptionalism. This is the challenge we face. This is why I'm doing these live streams. I'm sharing my second cup of coffee with you. This is why I wrote my book on settling truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. This is why I'm talking about these issues. This is why I ran for president in 2020. We have to learn how to address these things, my relatives. We have to learn how to talk honestly about them. And until we do, we're only going to continue to not only perpetuate, but strengthen this myth of American exceptionalism. And it's a myth which is actually rooted in the lie of white supremacy. We can do better. We must do better. I'll end with the quote by George Erasmus, who said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community, we have to start by creating a common memory. I wore this shirt today specifically for this reason. It's one of my favorite shirts from a conference I spoke at Calvin University. It's their Unlearn conference. I love this shirt. I love the phrase of this. We have to unlearn our mythological history so that we can learn, create a common memory. I can't have my relatives walk in beauty. May we learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakona.